everyone for being here this afternoon. I really appreciate your time. Before we start, we also just want to acknowledge and honor that the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes are the original people of the land upon which the University of Denver stands. Even though this is a virtual conference, we felt it important to do that. And we hope that today we'll have an engaging conversation regarding environmental justice with BIPOC communities. We also just want to acknowledge the racial injustice that's present in our nation right now and kind of honor that before we got started. So we're going to do some self-introductions. My name is Rachel Forbes. I'm a social worker and I'm an educator here at the University of Denver. I'm also I'm an associate professor of the practice and the Wesco MSW program director at the School of Social Work. And my teaching and my research interests include environmental justice and climate change, and also rural social work practice. And this year I put together a small research team of dedicated graduate students to discuss and explore environmental justice. And so our mini research team submitted the proposal for today's panel discussion. Anna, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hello, my name is Anna Kriggs. I am an environmental policy and management graduate student with DU's University College. Climate change, environmental issues, and equal rights for all has always been a massive passion and focus in my life. Academic and career-wise, I want to do whatever I can to further the mission of equality and equity and make a difference in or end climate change.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Kaylee Peterson. I'm a Master's of Social Work student at the University of Denver's Graduate School of Social Work in the Western Colorado program. Being born and raised in rural Western Colorado, I've always been very curious about how humans both rely on and alter their physical environment, and feel that as a social worker, it's my responsibility to advocate for policies and practice that ensure the health and wellness of those most vulnerable to environmental injustices.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited that you're all here. My name is Sarah Walkley. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a dual master's student at the School of Social Work in Corbell. And I'm interested in a lot of things, but I'm here today because I think we should be challenging accepted ideas around how we seek justice, particularly in the context of environmental justice.
Okay. This profession of social work has a long history of promoting environmental justice in partnership with oppressed communities. Social workers can play an important role in engaging with BIPOC communities to promote environmental justice, especially in regard to access to safe and healthy water, housing, and food, which are some topics that we will explore today on our panel. This panel will also provide a call to action for the profession of social work to further fight environmental racism in partnership with BIPOC communities. But we need to recognize that this work cannot be done by social workers alone, and it must be an interdisciplinary effort, as diverse expertise and perspectives are needed to promote equitable and just systems in the face of ecological destruction and global environmental change. This panel will highlight advocacy efforts on part of social workers in partnership with community groups, including grassroots mutual aid efforts, advancing environmentally just policies and restorative approaches to building equitable food and housing systems. Lastly, this research group assumes a positionality of fostering ecological justice in framing this proposal, which affirms the interconnections between social and environmental justice for all life forms.
We will come back to these questions after each panelist speaks to have a discussion.
I can't hear you, Anna.
So the questions are, what is environmental racism? How does it show up in your communities? How can white community members show up as allies to BIPOC communities in the face of environmental injustice? What examples of environmental justice work are we aware of that can be considered best practice examples? What work must still be done moving forward to promote environmental justice for all communities and fight environmental racism?
So today we hope to have a discussion on the intersections of environmental justice within a racialized context. But what is environmental racism? Environmental racism is environmental policy, practice, or directive that differently impacts or disadvantages, whether it's intentional or not, individuals, groups, or communities based on their race, ethnicity, or color. Environmental racism forces people of color, including Indigenous, Black, and Latinx communities, to bear the brunt of environmental degradation and the negative impacts of climate change. BIPOC communities are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis as they breathe more polluted air, live in hotter temperatures, experience more natural disasters, are displaced at higher rates, and often have limited resources to respond to the crises. In the occupied lands, now collectively known as the United States, environmental racism has deep roots embedded in economic and racial inequalities, included but not limited to genocide, segregation, immigration, and racial discrimination in practically all aspects of life for communities of color. Environmental racism is a form of institutionalized discrimination, and it is reinforced by our government, legal, economic, social, political, and military institutions, and it can take on a multitude of forms. It perpetuates an inequitable and unjust society through environmental circumstances that contribute to and maintain health disparities among historically oppressed racial and ethnic groups. The world is in a global environmental crisis as a result of climate change, human-induced destruction, environmental injustice, and the ecological devastation of land, air, water, and living beings. The consequences are now being felt across generations, with BIPOC communities experiencing the disproportionate impacts of environmental justice and climate change. But what are some examples of environmental racism? Here are just a few. Minorities, migrant workers, and Native Americans are more likely to be exposed to environmental harms. Black communities are 70% more likely to live in counties that are in violation of federal air pollution standards. Latinx communities are 165% more likely to live in counties with unhealthy levels of particulate matter pollution, and are also more likely to have low-paying jobs that expose them to greater environmental risks like higher temperatures, droughts, wildfires, and heat waves. 86% of Alaska Native villages are susceptible to flooding and erosion. And in light of the current global pandemic, it should also be mentioned that COVID-19 worsens the role environmental injustice already plays in oppressed communities, and environmental racism has left Black communities especially vulnerable to COVID-19.
Thanks so much for that, Rachel. So I'm going to extrapolate from that in a few ways. Firstly, I want to challenge everyone to think of environmental injustice as being violence, more specifically as violence enacted by the state in partnership with big, increasingly unregulated industries such as the fossil fuel industry. Secondly, I want folks to ask themselves, what could we be getting wrong with some of our go-to ways of seeking justice? So by that I mean, where are there contradictions and what are we maybe assuming? And thirdly, I want to suggest that we as social workers or activists or whoever we are, as allies or co-conspirators with BIPOC communities, can utilize our power and our privilege to be subversive in ways that we support communities who are facing violence that is enacted by the state. Slide. So with Black Lives Matter being a movement against police violence, we often oscillate between phrases like police brutality and state-sanctioned violence. And this latter term, which we're hearing more and more of, I think we should really hold on to it, because we should hold on to this understanding of it, but not just in the context of police murder, but within the realm of environmental injustice. And when I say state-sanctioned violence, I'm referring not just to the actions of the government that Rachel mentioned, but also to the violence enacted by industries, because the state sanctions those too, through their partnerships and protections of them. And those disproportionality statistics that we just heard, they're pointing to violence. And it's important that when we use them, we're also calling out the structures and the people who are responsible for creating these stats. We must speak truth to power. And we need to recognize that many forms of environmental racism, like other manifestations of racism, are causing premature deaths in these communities. This is violence. If we acknowledge that environmental injustices that we see across our country and across our world, if we acknowledge them to be violence, then we next need to ask ourselves, violence enacted by who? And I think at this point, I have made it clear that I'm talking about violence enacted by the state. And when you hear these disproportionality statistics on the news or wherever else, we need to be asking, violence enacted by who? Because when we ask these questions, it points to very deep histories of violence that this country tries so hard to ignore while it continues to perpetuate them. And we really need to sit with the fact that these histories are manifest today. So what are we going to do about it? When state and industry decide to redirect pipelines out of white communities and into indigenous ones, like they did with the Dakota Access Pipeline, they are sparing white communities from this violence and sacrificing Black and brown ones. They are saying, these lives are disposable and these lives are not. This is violence. So this brings me to my second question. Does it make sense to expect justice from the same people who are perpetuating the violence? In other words, does state policy really offer the best solutions for us to seek justice? And if it doesn't, what are our other options? And I just ask that all of us are critical of the state when we are organizing efforts of justice seeking. So we can and we should advocate for policy changes, but we should also consider these actions as harm reduction. Legislation, if it comes, it often comes long after violence is enacted. Therefore, it helps protect future people from violence. And this is crucial and extremely important, and we need to be doing this. So I suggest having one foot inside the system and one foot out, so to speak. And this is where subversion comes in. So what is subversion? Or what does it mean to be subversive? It can be described by a dictionary as undermining of the power and authority of an established institution, a systematic attempt to undermine a political system by persons working secretly within them. But to me, challenging illegitimate power is subversive. Any power that says these people are worth saving and these people we can dispose of, we should be systematically challenging any of these systems that uphold this violence. So we saw state violence in the wake of Flint's state-sanctioned water crises and the disasters of Katrina, Sandy, and Maria. What was also in these places, though, were deep histories of state violence before the disasters. But there was something else that many of us probably did not see, and this was the mutual aid, grassroots, subversive efforts by community members and their allies in the name of survival and self-determination. And here are some examples. So in 2015, Flint residents went through non-state measures and enacted a resident-led study in order to test water in a truth-revealing and trustworthy way through their partnership with Virginia Tech. Residents organized trainings in basements of churches, and they taught their neighbors how to test the water in their homes. They ended up testing 4 times the number of homes than the state had tested in the previous 4 months. And the state had only tested those homes that they knew would have low lead. And then in 2017, after Hurricane Maria, a bunch of activists from mutual aid disaster relief, many of whom had family in Puerto Rico, traveled there to offer support to struggling communities. They quickly learned that there was a government warehouse that was just literally sitting on stockpiles of life-supporting supplies and not being distributed to the people there. So the organizers showed up with their self-made badges that literally read Mutual Aid Disaster Relief on them. And they said, we're here for the 8 o'clock pickup. And they were told that their names were not on the list, but the organizers insisted. And they were eventually let in and took whatever they wanted. And then after this, the organizers made more badges so more people could go in and return. And so they returned again and again. And this lasted for months. And then in 2005, after Hurricane Katrina, people with close friends in New Orleans tried to cross a military blockade to enter to see if their friends were even alive and to offer support to the devastated communities. And in order for them to actually get past the bureaucracy, the organizers created doctored passes, much like in the previous example. And ultimately, these fake passes and $50 led to the Common Ground Collective, which was a serious mutual aid effort that eventually assisted some 150,000 families from the years 2005 to 2008. Even FEMA started referring people to them. So some of what Common Ground did was they set up self-defense patrols to defend against law enforcement and the white vigilantes from places like Algiers Point. They gutted houses, they removed debris, and they tarped roofs. They established a permanent aid distribution center and a medical clinic, both which were open 7 days a week. They cut the locks off of a school and cleaned it out. They ran soil tests. They set up internet phone access sites, and they did so much more than just those things. And then Occupy Sandy, 2012, which in many ways modeled itself off of the last example of Common Ground. They arguably ended up assisting the most people the most effectively through principles of mutual aid and acts of subversion. So if we acknowledge that the root of environmental injustice is state and industry sanctioned violence, then we can straddle social change work inside and outside of these systems through both harm reduction, so things like policy, but also subversive efforts at a grassroots level, like the ones I just shared. So white folks as allies or co-conspirators or comrades, they can utilize their power and privileges to support and not control efforts when seeking environmental justice and self-determination for these communities. And I also just want to end by addressing the fact that we need to recognize the crucial need for consent when engaging in subversive efforts. And also note that subversion can have numerous appearances, and it is important to remember that it does not take the place of anti-racist education, and it can indeed do harm if not informed by it. And then these are just some of the books that have informed some of my reading. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, for addressing those injustices. Learning about Hurricane Maria has been one of the most eye-opening examples that I have come across studying environmental injustices. Another example of environmental injustice is gentrification. Gentrification is the process whereby the character of a poor urban area is changed by wealthier people moving in, improving housing, and attracting new businesses, typically displacing current inhabitants in the process. A new zoning trend has appeared in Denver, exemplifying gentrification, pushing out the working class and minorities, creating high housing prices that are too high for these individuals compared to their minimum income. According to the United States Census Bureau of 2019, individuals who are BIPOC have a higher poverty rate than those who are not. Black individuals were estimated to be 18.8% in poverty, Hispanics to be 15.7%, and Asians to be 7.3%, which compared to the majority non-Hispanic white individuals at a poverty rate of 7.2%, this is considerably lower. Metro Caring, a nonprofit organization and food bank represented in this slide here, is located in the neighborhood of Uptown of the Denver metro area. It serves tens of thousands of households per year. Recently, there has been construction of a pair of high-rise apartment buildings who have a parking garage with an entrance and exit in the way of Metro Caring receiving bay. Lucor Jordan, a graduate student in cultural anthropology here at the University of Denver, was a former intern and volunteer for Metro Caring. I also met Lucor through our work as research fellows with the Center for Sustainability that was focused on similar research to the scenario I'm about to describe. It also looks like a few of our participants today were part of this research team. A few summers ago, Lucor received an emergency email which notified the Metro Caring community of a commissioner hearing where they could testify against the construction of the high-rises. Lucor, Metro Caring members, and residents of the community all went to the hearing. About an hour into the hearing, Lucor states that It was only at that point that we realized the hearing that would have heard our concern took place a decade previously. But this hearing that they were at was about a zoning discrepancy concerning architectural elements of those high-rises. The commissioners claimed the community was notified of the construction 10 years prior, but what LUCOR gathered from the locals was that they had no idea about the construction. Dr. Pello, professor at UC Santa Barbara and climate activist, states, policy structures perpetuate injustices. During my interview with LUCOR, he explains that commissioners were following the set protocols and zoning regulations that they have to, or they would have ended up losing their government position, while the developers were acting in a way to achieve the best returns on their investments, or they would lose their job as well. So the commissioners and developers did not have a direct intention to be discriminative, but the structures of zoning policy that are set up in this country from institutional racism based off of settler colonialism. Metro Caring, the organization itself, is a grassroots effort. More of these efforts will be mentioned by Kaylee following. These efforts are great examples of micro practices to the overall repression of environmental injustices in social work. In contrast, the Green New Deal requires both meso and macro practices or efforts to form community action and policy advocacy. Macro, meaning large scale, of course, or as in major policy initiatives, which I subscribe to, being an environmental policy and management master student, and meso efforts being in between the micro and macro practices, the medium-sized efforts. As many of you know, Congress Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Edward J. Markey, and a few other representatives proposed the Green New Deal, which will work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while also addressing economic inequality and racial injustices in the United States. The National Association of Social Workers suggests that the Green New Deal is an environmentally proactive policy and social workers should commit to advancing its goals. It might be intuitive, but we ask that social workers need to be mindful and critical of any form of advocacy, like Sarah had mentioned earlier. I also ask that any sort of environmental advocate or activist needs to be critical of all policies and forms of advocacy and use an equitable lens when making these judgments. To quote Joe Biden, our current president, from his inauguration speech, "A cry for racial justice some 400 years in the making moves us. The dream of justice for all will be deferred no longer." Thank you.
All right, thanks. So now that we've heard from Rachel, Sarah, and Anna, I would like us all to think about the role that we can take both personally and professionally to address environmental injustices. Danielle Williams, the creator of a BIPOC outdoor recreation affinity group called Melanin Base Camp, published a guide to outdoor allyship a few years ago that I found to be useful. So in this guide, it is stated that to be an ally, we must, of course, first be aware of our biases and understand the level of relative privilege we hold. And we should also be willing to discuss race and power dynamics, which both help and harm ourselves and others. Then, probably most importantly, we must not be compliant with racist systems and be proactive when we witness environmental injustices, just like everyone has already mentioned. Being an ally requires us to understand when it is necessary to take a leadership role and seeing when others who are more experienced and more competent in the issue have already filled that role, and it is best for us to instead provide support. Like Melanin Base Camp is a space specifically for outdoorsy people, there are plenty of other organizations and grassroots groups who are dedicated to working in food systems. For example, the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, a coalition of Black-led organizations, is taking on over 100 years of racist and discriminatory policies enforced by the USDA and other institutions. They are seeking liberation of Black farms and are building power in their communities. They are doing this by reframing narratives about Black food and land. Leaders in this movement are sharing strategies and innovation for sustainable farming for future generations of Black farmers. One way we can act as an ally for a group like this is by participating in the direct actions they organize. Much like the examples that Sarah mentioned, this can be blockades, protests and boycotts, and other types of actions that disrupt the status quo and call for accountability from corrupt industries. On an even more basic level, we can also support grassroots missions by promoting their BIPOC leaders to positions of power within our communities. This is also where community organization is required to allocate resources. This could be acquiring funding, labor, expertise, or technology, anything to create and maintain local, diverse food networks that are sustainable and equitable. We can also participate in influencing legislation on a more micro level. The Justice for Black Farmers Act of 2020, which is led by Senator Cory Booker, is endorsed by the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. This piece of legislation is intended to reform the USDA and create a land grant program specifically for Black farmers. This bill will, in theory, rein in corporate power over the industry and allow Black farmers to utilize regenerative practices that will mitigate the effects of the climate crisis. Of course, the criticism of this act is that it focuses primarily on Black farmers and aims to reform rather than replace a historically racist institution. However, I do feel that this bill also highlights that policy can be responsive to grassroots causes when enough pressure is applied. And of course, the right people are in a position of power to do something. So if there are examples of environmental racism in your communities, we should start talking about them and find others who share that viewpoint. I know it takes time and effort, but it is worth it to seek out your local representatives and compel them to draft a response and then action plan to address your concerns and demands. It is their job. There are so many grassroots movements we can get involved with to address environmental racism and act as allies with BIPOC communities. And for whatever reason, if there aren't already groups existing, we do have the power to create them too.
Okay. So that is the end of our content for our panel. And then when we submitted the proposal to have this panel discussion today, these were the kinds of questions that we thought we could engage around following some of the content we just presented. And we also want to make sure that we have space and time for folks who are in the room to chime in with questions, reflections, any shares or thoughts that they might have even outside of these open discussion questions. And so the rest of our time, Emily, the conference organizer, has asked us to end at 1:50 so that the next panel could get organized for their presentation. So I think we have about 15 minutes or so. So Emily, is it possible for folks to unmute themselves and ask questions, or how does the Q&A component go?
So in this format, folks can either utilize the chat or the Q&A function. And so we can sort of have a back and forth happening between you all, the presenters, and folks in the chat. We did have a couple of questions come through while you were speaking. If you wanted to address those first, we can sort of proceed however you would like.
Okay. That sounds good. If there are questions from the chat, we could talk about them.
Yeah. So Balam Pineda wrote, they're joining us from Mexico, and they were curious, are we acknowledging the need to build transnational coalitions among the various BIPOC organizers and activists that are currently fighting racial capitalism in somewhat isolated matters? So for example, their experience is seeing what's happening on both sides of the US-Mexico border.
I think that's a great insight and a great question. I would say that that's certainly a need to work across borders and across cultures and communities to address these harms, which we know are at a global scale. The climate crisis doesn't just impact me here in Western Colorado, right? It's far-reaching, and so I think we're going to need solutions that are multiracial, multi-ethnic, and kind of go across borders for sure.
Yeah, I would add to that. That as someone who finds themselves in different activist spaces, that is a big problem, is kind of like this lack of like tangible solidarity. Like I like to think that the solidarity is there regardless of if folks are connecting because the struggles are shared. But for example, with the Green New Deal, there are, it's really a national legislation of a bunch of different policies. So there's really nothing in the Green New Deal that addresses what it means to have a United States that is running on renewable energy. So to me, the problem with that is that we champion a Green New Deal blindly a lot. I think it's a great thing. Like we should be pushing for it, but we also should be critical of it because it doesn't address the fact that in order for a nation like ours to transition to renewable energy, it will require extraction and exploitation elsewhere, which it already does do, and we don't have 100% renewable energy. So until the Green New Deal acknowledges in some way the harms that would be done, like I have a really hard time imagining how we can expect good things to come from it if it's not touching globally. So if we're going to say Black Lives Matter and we're going to champion these causes, then we need to think about the Black and brown folks who don't live in the United States, whose lives are going to be extremely impacted by if the United States transitioning to 100% renewable energy. So that is something that I think of when we're talking about transnational coalition building. And yeah, I just hope to see more of it in this country, especially.
Mm-hmm. That's a great response, Sarah. And I also note that Sarah Bexel in the chat has kind of alluded to some of this as well with her comment and question. Sarah said, how will humans end this violence against each other, Earth, and other species if we continue to refuse that human population growth is a problem and our thirst for new technology and economic growth are not addressed? If we don't drill, for example, in the United States, will we drill in even more fragile environments with possibly more vulnerable populations depending on those environments? So I think that kind of goes to your point, Sarah, too, about like, where are the harms coming from? What other questions or comments do we have from our participants?
Yeah, we had another question come through in the Q&A. Lorena wants to know, how can white folks who want to support BIPOC impacted communities show up in respectful ways, i.e. as followers, not as quote unquote the voice of the voiceless?
That's a wonderful question, Lorena. Thank you so much. I think as Sarah mentioned before, I think we just need to, I think consent is really important. I think that we need to learn to be there, as listeners and as people who are being given directive and not necessarily being the voices and the experiences that are at the center of the work. And I think that can be a real challenge. I think that that's something that, usually with folks with privilege are used to being sometimes the loudest voices in the rooms and used to being leaders in this work. But instead we need to conversely do the opposite and to be more of the followers and the listeners and to make sure that we have consent for the work that we want to do and make sure that the work that we're doing is not doing more harm than good. What else do we think from our panelists?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that it's really important to do your research and figure out what's already happening, and then join that cause in a way that is appropriate for that grassroots movement. Like, what do they need, and what kind of support are they seeking? We have to find out what they need before we can act.
What I try to do personally is just be as respectful as I can, kind of address my own privilege, but not in too much of an outright manner. And, I guess treat everyone the way you want to be treated. Kind of a lame saying, but it makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything to add. This is something I struggle with as a social work student because of like phrases like intervention and things like that. So yeah, I think just for me, it's always just being very critical of myself and how I'm showing up and just the spaces that I'm in. And yeah, just being mindful of a lot of things, realizing that this work has been done before white activists decided to talk to people about it on panels like this, for example. But I think part of our work is educating other white people on these topics. So I think that's something that we can do, but going back to consent, we have to make sure that we're doing it in a very respectful way, and that we're not telling stories that are not ours to tell.
Exactly. And then and I saw the Raina followed up in the chat to make sure that, you know, the support is even being asked for to begin with, right? So not like imposing yourself, or you mentioned the word intervention, you know, because I think a lot of times folks with privilege assume, you know, within that power dynamic that they're needed and that they have the solutions and that their way of doing things is the right way and is automatically helpful, which is incorrect to assume. And I think we need to be mindful of that as well. And then we have a couple questions I'm seeing. Someone is asking about local community organizations led by communities of color that we're connected with here at DU. I mean, the Metro Caring example that Anna gave is down in Denver. Kaylee and I are out here in Western Colorado, and I would say that the group that I'm most closely linked with is Nuestra Tierra, and it's a Latinx-led group that works for environmental justice for the Latinx community here in Western Colorado. And they're through the Wilderness Workshop located in Carbondale, and I can share that contact after the panel is done. But they're a really great organization doing work with the Latinx community fighting environmental racism here on the Western slope. I know Sarah's down on the Front Range. Anna or Sarah, do you have any other organizations that you might want to chime in about that would be important groups for our participants to know about?
Yeah, so I do my internship at CLARO, which is Colorado's Latino Leadership Advocacy organization. So I'm also brand new to Denver. So I saw someone, yeah, we're answering that same question, okay. Yeah, I come from a background of organizing with the Sunrise Movement, and I pay dues to DSA and those kinds of things, but since being here, I've been trying to find kind of like my political home, I guess, but in the meantime, I work with CLARO.
Yeah, I can't be too helpful with that right now because of COVID right now. I'm pretty much at home. I'm sure there's many efforts online if you do some research.
Okay, other questions or comments? I noted that our the DU Center for Sustainability has put some information in. Revision's also wonderful. They actually did an event for us here in Western Colorado surrounding food justice a couple of years back. Wonderful organization. I had a comment or a question. Somebody had asked to stop the screen share so that they can see us. The only other content that we had on the slides was just our contact information. So I'll make sure to type my email address into the chat right now so that people can see it. If anyone wants to contact us after today, I'd be more than happy to chat with you all.
All right, well, should we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think that's it. Anna, I know you had some parting words if you want to lead us through those.
Yeah, to wrap up our presentation, we want to thank the BIPOC community fighting for environmental justice across the globe. And thank you to the University of Denver's Center for Sustainability for hosting this event, especially Chad and Emily, and to all of you for your participation today. Have a good day.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you, Rachel, Kaylee, Sarah, and Anna for a fantastic discussion and presentation. Thank you all for coming and for participating in such thoughtful and wonderful ways. We have programming all the way through this afternoon, so feel free to join us. Next up, we'll be talking about some Denver initiatives to move away from plastic. We'll be doing some professional development work. And then our last session of the day, we'll be learning about team science, also to help support BIPOC communities. And so we hope to see you later on. And thank you again, everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks everyone for your time.